Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 6 of the Sobriety Matters podcast. If you're listening to this on the day of publish, happy Thanksgiving to everyone in the United States who may be celebrating. For everyone else in the world, happy Thanksgiving to you as well. And hopefully you are enjoying turkey just like the rest of us. Let's get into this episode. This episode we're joined by Amy Willis, and we start off by getting into the unexpected death of her father, and how that impacted Amy deeply, and over time drove her to her sobriety and her recovery journey after realizing that she needed to create and hold boundaries, and she needed to begin to question her own problematic relationship with alcohol. And as we get through Amy's story and her addiction, we fast forward to today, and we hear how Amy has taken these unfortunate events to not only drive her self-awareness and recovery, but also working now as a full-time sobriety and mindset coach for others. We also discuss Amy's teaching techniques and practices that are rooted in meditation, mindfulness, and really creating a space that allows her clients to empower themselves. We get into the very, very interesting but effective world of emotional freedom techniques. Those are also referred to as tapping. And I'll let Amy do the explaining of all of that, being that she is an expert and is certified in this EFT and tapping technique. As we near the end, you will hear that Amy has been extremely gracious and has offered a special gift to the listeners and is providing her 5-step guide to kickstarting your sobriety workbook, as well as a very generous 10% off discount on her one-on-one coaching. That offer can be redeemed with the special code Sobriety.Matters 10 on Amy's website, and I will be sure to provide all of that information in the show notes, and you'll be able to access all of that from Amy's website and her social media accounts as well. So, as always, please be sure to rate and review the show wherever it is that you consume the episodes. And I just want to be sure that we're able to reach as many sober, curious, early recovery, and long-term sobriety folks as possible. And those ratings and reviews really, really take it to the next level for that. So with all the housekeeping details in order, let's get on to the most important piece, and let's hear from Amy. Hi, Amy, and thank you for joining the Sobriety Matters podcast. I appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule and joining me for this episode.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So, Amy, let's kick this off and have you tell us a little bit about who you are. So maybe tell us where you're from, a few tidbits about yourself and maybe how long you've gotten in recovery.
Sounds good. So I am from London, Ontario, Canada, but I live in Toronto and I've been here the better part of 20 years. So it's more home than anywhere else at this point. I have been sober as of August of this year for 5 consecutive continuous years, which is really exciting. And I work professionally as a sobriety and mindset coach, inspired by my own journey into sobriety. I really felt compelled and inspired to support other women in changing their lives in really powerful ways. And so I feel really honored and grateful that I get to do that work. And when I'm not working, you can probably find me working out or hanging out with my cat or I took up cross stitch during COVID. So I've been stitching up a storm. Or yeah, just chilling out with my friends now that we can actually be together.
Excellent. So cross stitch. I'm gonna have to start seeing some of these stitching projects here. I've seen some very impressive stuff that people have done. And cross stitching is one of those that I definitely have heard people picked up during COVID. So that's
Yeah.
awesome. Excellent. I appreciate you going through that, giving us a little bit of background. You get the honor of being my first Canadian on the show. So congratulations on that. Even though you are
Thank
in,
you.
even though you are in Toronto, and most of the United States can say they're north of that, but I work with a guy in Toronto, so we're always razzing him. We're like, "Are you really?" And he's like, "Well," and so it's always a good time. So, welcome to the show. Thank you. So let's dive right into this, and let's talk about your story. Let's talk about your battle with alcohol, kind of your march into recovery, what recoveries look like for you, and you start as early as you would like. Where did alcohol start to become that problem for you? So.
Mhm. So I would say, so I started drinking when I was 16. And I think, a lot of folks start to experiment at that time, high school age. So I was drinking alongside a lot of my friends at the time. And I think on the outside, it looked very similar to what everybody else was doing. But what was actually happening for me was I was really trying to escape what was happening in my life. So when I was 16, my family exploded. So there was a very traumatic incident that happened between my parents. And they ended up separating with a lot of extras on top of it. So I was living through this trauma day in and day out for months on end without any real support or coping strategies or outlets to deal with what I was living through. And so that was really hard. And I didn't really have anybody to talk to, but I did have alcohol. And so it really became this thing that allowed me to escape and just press pause on everything else that was happening in my life. And obviously, when we start drinking, we don't know how vulnerable we may be or may not be to developing an addiction. So obviously I didn't know when I was 16 what I know now about addiction and alcohol and how it's this progressively addictive substance. But like when I started drinking at 16, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with ACEs or adverse childhood experiences. It's that test that basically, assesses based on how much childhood trauma you've experienced, there's a relationship between that and developing an addiction later on in life. And I had an ACEs score of 6 when I started drinking. And so I was already more primed, I guess, or groomed to develop an addiction, which I didn't really know. And early on in my drinking, I was also doing things that now we would look at if, somebody we knew was doing this, we'd be like, that's, a pink flag or a red flag. Like I started drinking alone in my bedroom very early on in my, time of drinking. And yeah, so, I kept kind of drinking, and as I went along, I was drinking more and more, and it was very much progressing. I regularly blacked out. I have tons and tons of time in my life, which is unaccounted for because of my drinking. And thinking back on that, it's really scary to think about because who knows, right? Like who knows what happened in those times. And yeah, so, I kept going. I went into university and I kept drinking. Like drinking culture is huge in universities, pretty much across the board. And outwardly, things looked fine. I finished my undergrad. I went on to do graduate work. I went after a lot of really great experiences. I was always working alongside of school. I always paid my bills. And internally was really where I was struggling. So, because alcohol is such a depressant, and because it so severely impacts and interferes with cognitive functioning and neurochemicals, my moods and my mental health were really impacted, like really, really. And now that I've been sober, and like sober as an adult with a fully formed brain, I know what my baseline is. And fortunately, like my mental health is generally really balanced and stable. Same with my moods. But when I was drinking, that was not the case. So my moods fluctuated significantly. I would say and do things that were out of character. And I would pick fights with people. And I often woke up after a night of heavy drinking, not necessarily feeling like I wanted to die, but feeling very indifferent about whether or not I wanted to keep living. And knowing where I am now, that also feels really scary to think back on. And I'm really grateful that I never took any actions in that direction. So yeah, I kept moving forward with my drinking, and I was consuming more and more as time went on. And in the later years of my drinking, I would notice the differences between myself and other people. I would go out to dinner with friends, and 5 friends would split a bottle of wine and I would have 2 to myself. And so, those differences became very, very noticeable and very hard to ignore. And so I think the biggest turning point that really shifted my drinking entirely, as well as truly like the trajectory of my life, was when my dad suddenly and unexpectedly died in 2014, and learning that his alcohol addiction had been a very significant part of his death. So essentially he drank himself to death, and we got that news, it was very sudden and very unexpected and horrible, as you can imagine. And I didn't immediately quit drinking. In fact, my addiction got a lot worse after he died. I was tremendously sad and overcome with grief. And I, really didn't know if I could handle or withstand the intensity of the feelings that I was experiencing. And so I drank about it. And I largely used his death as an excuse for my drinking, because who was going to challenge the person who's drinking a lot when their dad had recently died, right? And so I was like, well, my dad died and I'm sad, so I'm going to keep drinking. So I drank pretty heavily for the next year or so. And at some point in 2015, after, the acute grief had passed, I was still drinking a ton. And it was at that point that I started to ask myself some like really serious questions about the role that alcohol played in my life. So I couldn't help but wonder. It was just this like nagging question that kept coming up. I was like, is this it? Like, is this life? Is this all there is? Because this was, for me, was my addiction. And it was spending all my time thinking about drinking. It was spending all my time planning on when I would be drinking next. It was wasting all my time being hungover, and then doing that damn cycle over and over and over. And I was like, there has to be more. There has to be more than this. Like, this cannot be all that there is. And I also was like simultaneously experiencing this small voice inside of me that was saying, like, you're made for more than this. Your life, you have a purpose here that isn't just like getting shit-faced and being hungover and miserable. Like, you are meant to do something with your life. And I don't know where that voice came from. I have no idea, but like, thank goodness. And so things over the next year started to change a little bit. So I tried to get sober. Admittedly, it was like a little half-assed. And I approached it in a very non-committal way. So I would quit for maybe 2 or 3 weeks and then convince myself that my drinking wasn't so bad. And then I would reward myself by drinking my face off. So I did that kind of cycle over the course of the year. And when I'm honest about it, like I don't think I made a real decision about changing my life and actually like quitting drinking altogether. And yeah, so eventually, and like, again, I don't know what was specific about this time, but I did arrive at that place where I was like, okay, I'm done. Like in August 2016, I finally made a real decision. I knew that there had to be more than where my life was and like where I was headed. And also in witnessing my dad's life and death, I also had a very clear trajectory of where my life was going if I didn't create some kind of serious change. So August 22nd, 2016 is my sober date. And as I mentioned, I've now been over 5 years sober. And initially, I decided that I was going to get sober for 6 months because the idea of forever without booze was just like way too much in the beginning. And then at the 6-month mark, I would reassess the situation. And as that date approached, I was terrified at the thought of drinking again. And I felt very sure that I would end up back where I was in no time, and things would continue to get worse. So it was really at the 6-month mark where I decided that like drinking did not serve me. I did not want to welcome it back into my life. And so it would no longer be something that I'm participating in ever again. So yeah, that's my drinking story and how I got to where I am right now.
Well, congratulations on 5 years sober. And I will say, Amy, you do an absolutely wonderful job of telling that story, of giving the details and just the little nuances in there that quite a few of us, and I'm sure probably the majority of us, can definitely relate to. You know, there was a couple of things in there that don't always get brought up, but one of them was, you know, a lot of us try to quit 100 times and we go about it very half-ass. And the one thing that you mentioned, though, that I for sure did was, well, I'm not going to drink for, 3 days during the week. Well, Thursday rolled around. What I do, I drank 6 times more than I normally would have on a Thursday. And that is an extremely, extremely vicious cycle that those in addiction can get into. You start, like you said, you start to reward yourself around that. So you mentioned your father's death, and it was alcohol related. You know, I'm sure for some people they're like, how could someone let themselves fall into something that potentially took one of their loved ones from? And, for anyone that's maybe sober curious listening to us or in early sobriety, we don't have to dwell on that too much, but could you touch a little bit on just the mindset that the grief puts you into, that it almost tells you you're doing the right thing in a way?
Oh man. So I was already well into my addiction by the time my dad died. So that was already, and like I said, like it's very progressive, right? It's not like somebody has an alcoholic beverage one day and then the next day they're on their deathbed. It's very progressive. And I think because we don't necessarily see the consequences day in and day out, we don't necessarily look any different or feel any different. that we think it's fine when it's actually really not. And couple that with it being this like really addictive substance that, you know, everywhere in the world tells us we should want it and we should say yes to it and we should be consuming it and it's a solution to all of our problems. It's actually very easy to like see how people get into addictive cycles and addictive patterns. But in my case, so my addiction was already in full swing, but I very much used my drinking and justified my drinking as self-care after my dad died. I was like, I get to do and say whatever I need right now to get myself through this horrendous situation. Like I was also the executor of my dad's will and estate. And for anybody who hasn't done that, it's basically a full-time job. You have to do all the paperwork. You have to do all the financials. You have to file that person's taxes. You have to, go through all their belongings and like execute on all their wishes. And so between that and feeling terrible and brokenhearted, I was like, I just need to get through this and I'm going to do whatever I need to do to get through this. And that's my version of self-care, and drinking is a huge part of that. And so I'm just going to keep drinking. And that was how I was able to justify and largely excuse how much more I was drinking at that time.
Yeah, it's interesting you touch on you've mentioned it a couple of times, the progressiveness of addiction as well. And for myself, in my recovery story, relapse is not something that has occurred. And I think partially that's because of how fast mine progressed. And it was, the last 18 months, the last 24 months was like, I became a different person so fast that it was just mind boggling. But in my recovery, the one thing I think that scared me away from it so much is where you pick back up. And for folks that have not thought about that, or, been through AA or 12-step programs, or really any program at that point, that haven't talked about where you progress to is where you're going to start back. And when you start back, if you think your progression was quick before, it's, they say it's 5, 10, 20 times faster. So I think it's interesting that you bring up that progressive piece and talking through that. So August 22nd of 2016 is your sobriety date, right? Yep. And it sounds like at that point you were tired of your own shit. You were where the rest of us were, have gotten, or maybe, and it's, sick and tired of being sick and tired. And you hear that old cliche, but it's so true. You're so mentally sick. You're so physically sick for some of us that take on that physical addiction. On that day that you decided, you talked about how you kind of went 6 months, and then once you got there, evaluated and moved through. But what did day one look like? And for that, the next 90 days, next 180 days, what were your tactics? What did you do to get sober? What was your support group? What it looked like?
So day one was terrible. I was super hungover. And I had gone out to like some kind of work party or something the night before, and it was like an open bar, and like, what a nightmare. So day one was awful because I was physically hungover and like puking and sweating and just like, all the shit that goes along with your body trying to like get rid of the poison that you shove down it. So it's interesting. So I had previously gone to Al-Anon meetings because of my stuff with my dad, and that was like really disruptive to our family unit. And then because AA is very common, it's like, the program that's been around longest, it's everywhere. There are meetings all the time. I live in a big city, so there's meetings like multiple times a day, every single day. So I went to a few meetings, and like whatever happened in those meetings, it didn't quite land for me. So I didn't continue on with that. What I did end up doing was largely, many things, but I connected with a lot of other sober women on Instagram. In a lot of cases, I reached out to them. And in a lot of cases, I wasn't even comfortable talking about the fact that I had struggled with addiction. So I just like quietly lurked in the background, mostly just taking some inspiration from the fact that there were other people out there who had experiences similar to mine. And now they were on the other side of it and thriving in their lives. Prior to what I'm doing now, I was in academia for a long time, and I worked in research labs and had a research-based master's degree. And so I spent a lot of time reading as much as I could to understand what addiction is, how it happens, what actually happens in our bodies when we put alcohol or other substances into it, what happens to our brain, how addiction is formed in our brain, like all of the things. I found that learning that information was tremendously helpful in me reestablishing or like reconfiguring my relationship to alcohol. I read everything I could get my hands on. And then I also really looked at my life, and not just like what I was doing when I was drinking, but everything around it. And for all the things that were supportive of my drinking habit, they had to go, at least temporarily, because I needed to basically establish like a clean slate for myself, where I didn't constantly have the temptation of it until I felt strong enough to withstand it. I changed what I was doing socially. I've done therapy off and on for years. And so I worked with a therapist a little bit more. And so I really think and starting off what you said with being tired of my own shit, I got radically honest with myself. And I was just like, it's not my fault that all this stuff happened in my life that made me more susceptible to addiction. But I do get to decide what happens next. And I'm the only one who can do it. I need to be responsible for my own life and for my choices. And so that was, I think, a really significant shift in the way I thought about everything. And yeah, so I would say all those things, like the books and the research, connecting with other women, that was really helpful, because I didn't have a lot of people in my life who were sober. And I also was like full of shame, and I couldn't even talk about it with a lot of people. And so that's where the, lurking in the background on social media came in really handy for me. So that's kind of a patchwork of things.
Yeah, it a patchwork, but I love how you gave the overall picture there, because when you start into sobriety, there may be one or two actions that you're going to hear, oh, I need to go do this, and this is what's going to get me sober. For me, it was go to detox and rehab and then start AA. But you quickly start to realize, nope, you're gonna need to clean that closet out. You're gonna have to really take everything out. You're really gonna need to take a look at it. And I think how you just walked through all those different pieces, and how you took a look at those, and you had to change everything. You had to look, inside of yourself and say, who am I hanging out with? What am I looking at, on social media? Who do I need to be surrounding myself around? You mentioned the books and reading everything that you could. And so I got into the quit lit world, probably about 2.5 years ago. And there's so many different levels of quit lit. It's memoirs of people telling their stories, but there's a lot out there that gets into the science of it now. And I've really submersed myself into reading about it. And I even have a few individuals in life that they're like, I kind of think you're crazy. And I'm like, what do you mean you think I'm crazy? And they're like, all you do is read about sobriety and alcoholism. And I'm like, it's so interesting to me. Like, I am that person. And, I think for some people, don't be afraid of that. Go and start reading and start educating yourself, and you'll really pick up on a lot of things that you'll realize you were doing, and you'll learn so much more too about yourself that, it eases some of the pain for yourself. Actually, it gives you a little bit of insight to, that's why I'm the way that I am. And now I get it. And it helps you move forward to work on yourself. So let's move into, you're a full-time sobriety coach now, professionally. And it sounds like for yourself, you use a lot of mindset, meditation, mindfulness. And so the one that I would like to start with, because you've got a couple that I want to talk about here in a minute, because I don't know anything about. So let's talk about mindfulness, though. And what that means. It can mean a lot of things, but let's have you kind of talk about mindfulness and why you think that's so important in sobriety, because I've been able to get myself there for a month, maybe 2 months at a time, and then I'll kind of fall back out of it. And I'm like, oh, I get it. I got to keep working on this. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about mindfulness and the use of that in sobriety, for sure.
Yeah. So when I talk about mindfulness, I am generally speaking of basically practicing self-awareness, being super present and grounded in the moment that you're in. So it could be when you're, for example, sitting down to eat a meal, instead of reading a book or watching TV, you take in that whole experience from a very mindful place. So you take in all the colors on your plate, you take in all the different flavors that are happening in your mouth. You take in the textures, you take in the aroma. You're just truly present to what you're actually experiencing in that moment. And one of the things that I have noticed in my sobriety is how present I am, how present I'm actually able to be now that I'm not mentally somewhere else, or at least mentally like foggy. And so, being able to be fully in the moment that you're in, I think it's very powerful in sobriety, because when you're present and, when you're present, you're actually able to take in everything that's happening around you. You're able to properly and appropriately identify how you're feeling and what's actually happening for you. And from that place, you get to decide what happens next. And so, I'm a meditation teacher as well. And having a meditation practice in place is something that really supports generally just being more mindful as we move through the world.
So meditation, I feel like scares people when it comes up a lot of times. And I personally have not been able to get into it. I've tried it. I know that I need to do it. But just talk about meditation and how to maybe get started with it, to use that as a tool.
Yeah. Oh man, it's one of my favorites. And I also know that there's like a huge barrier for lots of folks in getting into it. Because I think that sometimes people think that they need to stop their thoughts, or they need to just empty their brains out, and that you need to sit in a full lotus position on a lily pad for hours on end in order to experience or, truly practice meditation. And so if that is you, I would just like to gently invite you to put all that to the side. And instead approach meditation from a place of curiosity. So really what meditation is just being able to, again, have that awareness that when thoughts are coming into your head, and it's not about stopping your thoughts, because your brain will think, your brain will continue to think. That's what it does. It's more about being able to recognize that thoughts are happening and just notice as they're happening and kind of let them go. So I don't know about you, but I often find myself, I'm thinking about something and then somehow I end up way over here thinking about or doing something else. And I'm like, holy shit, how did I get there? And the practice of meditation allows you to notice those thoughts as they're coming in and be more selective about which ones you want to engage in. And so applying that to sobriety, being able to choose your thoughts and being able to choose where you put your attention and where you engage is really, really powerful. So if you're able to do this, for example, if you're experiencing a craving or having an urge to drink, being able to selectively engage with or dismiss or redirect a thought is an incredibly powerful tool to have at your disposal. And for folks who are interested in maybe getting started with a meditation practice, and remember, it's a practice, right? It's always practice. I would say start with a guided meditation app, because sometimes it can be quite daunting to just think about sitting down for a few minutes and just being alone with your thoughts. Like for a lot of folks, that's a very overwhelming idea. So start with a guided meditation. The meditation app that I love and have been using for years is called Insight Timer app. And there is a free version. It's very robust. You can select based on theme of the meditation, the length of the meditation, the instructors, etc. That's a really excellent starting point. And I would say start with 5 minutes, a day if you can. And maybe pair it with something you're already doing. So like maybe right before you go to bed or right as soon as you wake up or after you have your lunch or something that you do every single day, just add 5 minutes on the end. And just start there. So start with a guided meditation and start with 5 minutes and just see how you feel. Those are my tips on getting started. And just like let go of all of those other preconceived notions that you have. And remember that, sitting for a meditation for 5 minutes, your life isn't going to be magically transformed after those 5 minutes, but with practice and with time and with consistency, you'll start to notice some of the benefits of meditation flow into your life outside of the times that you're actually practicing.
Yeah, and meditations, it's one of those things that is on the top of my mind right now because 3.5 years into sobriety, I almost am starting to feel like I've had underlying ADD, which a lot of adults can find in recovery that they do have ADD, but I think that I'm just aware and my brain is so sharp that it does what you were talking about. And it's like, I'm over here in left field all of a sudden. And what I would like to do is implement that meditation practice to be like, all right, you've been working for a couple hours. You're all over the place. You're not being efficient. Take 5 minutes, do some meditation, get back in line here and do that, because that is, I've gotten into the world that trying to do things holistically and as natural as possible, clearly, as an addict is the best way we can do that. So thank you for touching on that. And it's definitely something that I'm interested in. And I'm sure many others that'll be listening to us will be too. Now, the one that you put in the pre-show questionnaire that I was like, okay, I got to go figure out what this is. Talk to me about EFT and the tapping. So I went and read about it. It seems extremely interesting. But please talk to me about what tapping is. This seems very interesting.
Yeah. So actually, the first time I heard about EFT, I was reading a book and it was describing what it is. And my very first response, I was like, what the fuck is this? And I closed the book and I put it on the bookshelf and I walked away and I didn't give it a second thought for literally years because I was like, I don't get it. And this seems weird.
I'm
So
glad you said that because I saw tapping and I'm like, what the hell is this lady talking about? I've got to go see what this is. And then I got there
yeah,
and I'm like, oh, this seems like it's something legitimate. So
yeah.
I can't wait to hear about this. This is
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, just to be, if you're like, what the heck is happening here? Legit. That's a legit response, because it sounds a little woo-woo and it sounds a little bit weird. And cut to now I'm a certified EFT practitioner. I've been practicing EFT for years. It's a modality I bring into my work with all my coaching clients because of how profoundly effective it is. So, in a nutshell, EFT stands for Emotional Freedom Techniques. It's also called tapping. And essentially, what we're doing is stimulating various acupressure points on our bodies. So it uses like the similar kind of principles of acupuncture minus the needles. So we're stimulating various acupoints on our bodies while thinking about or verbalizing what has previously been like a stressful or distressing or traumatic incident or experience for you. And while verbalizing it and stimulating the acupressure points on our body, we're actually rewiring our brain's experience with that stressful situation so that when we experience it or something like it again, we respond in a more calm way.
Well,
Does that make sense?
yeah, I mean, it does make sense. I think for folks that are like, huh? I mean,
Yeah.
go look it up, online, and read a little more about it. I think it's awesome for them to have the context from you though, of someone that's certified in it and give it a little bit of background. But yeah, like I said, I've been in recovery for 3.5 years, and that's the first time it had come up. And
Yeah.
that's why I love doing these things though. That's why I love building my sober community, because there's so many things out here for us all to find what works for us. There's so many platforms, so many techniques. And so, and I love doing these things too. And when things come together, because I was actually going to go back and touch on, traumatic situations in life for those that are trying to get sober or that have been sober for a while, and you just touched on it. I know exactly
Yeah.
how you take care of that now with your clients. And so
Yeah. And
that
myself.
yeah, that's cool. I love that. Yep, that is excellent. So let's talk about professionally being a sobriety coach.
Yeah.
So what did you do professionally before you got sober?
Oh, can I just say two things very quickly about
Yeah,
EFT and then I'll
absolutely.
circle back?
No, please do. Absolutely.
Okay. So one, for anybody who's interested and they're like, what the heck? I actually have a ton of tapping videos on my Instagram channel, including an intro video called What the Heck is EFT? And so you actually have me like tapping through the points and talking about what it is and how it works and like the areas of the brain that it stimulates. So that's like a really helpful thing. And then also tapping sessions on very broad topics like people pleasing or boundaries or when you're feeling overwhelmed or whatever it is. So like those are really helpful resources that just exist in the world if folks are interested. And then the second thing is there have been a lot of studies. Like I told you, I'm a research nerd. So I'm like, I want to learn about the science behind EFT. And there have been tons and tons of studies showing how effective it is, particularly in areas of PTSD, anxiety, depression, disordered eating, and then addiction as well. So it's like a very promising emerging field. So I just wanted to add that in.
Oh, I'm glad you did, and I will be sure when the episode goes live and everything, I'll be sure to put links so that folks can access those resources.
Okay, cool.
I do potentially think there is a missed opportunity though with the what is EFT video. It should be labeled just one big acronym, and it's WTF EFT. And so we could go with that path. And so,
I actually, one of my former coaches has a video about tapping called that.
Yeah, see, there we go. All right. I love it. That's my marketing brain working there. So
yeah,
SEO at its prime. Yeah. So let's talk about how you became a sobriety coach. Let's talk a little bit about what you were doing. Because I don't think you were a sobriety coach before you got sober. So maybe what you were doing, and then when did that all transition? Because I see a lot of folks in sobriety saying, I think this is my calling. This is what I want to do. And I love that because it does help folks with their sobriety, but just kind of talk a little bit about how that came to be, and give some folks some, advice on what that's going to look like if that's the case.
So yeah, in my previous life, I was in HIV prevention research by chance. So I got into it in the later years of my undergrad, and then I focused my graduate work on that. And then I worked in a research lab, and like worked at the UN for a time, so that was very much my life. And then actually my dad died. And so many things just kind of shifted. And I had that, like, if I'm not loving this, or like, if I don't, if this doesn't light me up, what's the point in continuing on? And so I had kind of like, I had already been in that field for a decade. And I was like, it doesn't light me up anymore. I love it and it's worthwhile work, but it doesn't have the fire in my belly feeling that I really want. And so I was doing just kind of a handful of like random jobs. And I think that the common theme, and even just like, I would say it's more a trait of who I am, is I've always had a desire to support people. I've always had a desire to help people. Teaching is one of my core strengths. So like supporting people through knowledge and ideas. And so I was toying with potentially, actually randomly, becoming a certified holistic nutritionist. And then I ended up going in a very different direction with the coaching training that I got. And it was very much rooted in habit change. And habits are, depending on who you ask, our daily behaviors are driven by habits largely. Like at least 40% of what we do day in and day out is driven by habit. And so if we're looking to create sustainable, lasting change in our lives, we need to actually look at our habits. And so, yeah, so getting sober and then having that urge to want to support people, and also having the urge to like live life on my own terms, i.e., not work for anybody else, work for myself, build the life that I want. I decided to pursue coaching and then built a business from there. I don't know if that answered what you were asking.
Oh, yes, it absolutely did.
Okay.
And I'm glad we went into that, because the more that I hear, it honestly tells me you were destined to be doing what you're doing right now, because you have such a great voice. You have a deep intelligence of going and finding the scientific pieces of things out from the research piece. Fortunate or unfortunate, however you look at it or other folks look at it, you have the experience of the addiction and the experience of the recovery. And so I will say that, you're someone that has come on here and told your story that is not just you're living it, but you're now out there doing incredible things with your voice and your experience. And so I just want to say kudos to you. And I want to just, say that it's been crazy to hear you talk about all this stuff. That quite honestly, I'm kind of blown away by it. So we've covered a lot. One thing that I always do before we totally wrap up here is I kind of give you the mic and I give you the platform to put your voice out there of what you would like to say to the sober curious, to the early recovery, and even those that have a little bit of sustained or long-term recovery, because we all know that we can always take that advice. So with that, I'll hand it over to you and let you say what you would like.
Mm-hmm. Well, also thank you for those kind words. And I absolutely agree. Like, this is 1,000% what I am supposed to be doing. And when I was saying earlier, like, there's more in your life. You're here for a greater purpose than like drinking your face off. Like, this is it. And I absolutely think, and I'm not religious so much as spiritual, and I absolutely think that my soul chose this journey, which included the addiction, which included losing my dad. All of those things are part of what got me to where I am. And, if my dad were still alive, I for sure would still be drinking. And so, all of that is part of it. And so I'm grateful for every experience, even the horrendous ones, because that's where we learn the most and grow the most and expand, in my experience. So in terms of advice for folks, a few things. I think it is never too late or too early to create change in your life. So I know sometimes in recovery spaces, we talk about like the rock bottom moment. And I think you don't have to wait for things to get worse before they can get better. And regardless of what has already happened in your life, you have a say in what happens next. And I think sometimes we forget that. So I wanted to offer that as a reminder. I think as another reminder that, just letting folks know that, we all already have everything that we need inside of us to create the change that we want, to create the lives that we want, and just remembering to connect to that inner voice and to connect to the gifts that are inside of us. Because I think we also forget and we disconnect from that, especially when we're putting substances into our bodies. And for folks who are maybe starting to think about their relationship to drinking, I think instead of asking the like yes or no question of, am I an alcoholic? Right? Because I think with that, it's we have, such a preconception of what that means to be an alcoholic, right? We think going to rehab or DUI or like, your life is crumbling. And I actually think like, yeah, that's an experience or experiences that a lot of people have. And a lot of people don't have those experiences, but still have a problematic relationship to drinking. So instead of asking that question, I think there are other questions we can be asking that might take us down an interesting road. So questions like, is alcohol supporting the life that I want to be living? Is alcohol serving me in positive ways? Is alcohol propelling me forward or holding me back? Do I like who I am when I'm drinking, right? I think these questions can probably unearth a lot more for us in our relationship to drinking, as long as we're willing to be really honest in our answers. And if you're not, that's okay. You can always come back to those questions. But I think radical honesty is a part of that equation. And I think finally, just, getting genuinely curious about your relationship to drinking is a really great place to start. I think a lot of folks engage with it from a place of habit, from a place of addiction. They don't really think about why they're drinking necessarily. It's just kind of become this thing that's like baked into their lives. And so getting curious, like, why am I having that? Or why do I want that? Or what am I looking to create by adding alcohol to the mix? I think, curiosity is such an underestimated but really powerful practice and tool that we can learn, I think, a lot about ourselves from. So yeah, I would say those things.
Well, that is some extremely powerful advice and messaging. I may be a little biased just because I think that you and I have a lot of common themes and a lot of common practices in our sobriety. Everyone's different, but I definitely see a lot of myself in you, in how you go about your sobriety and the way that you think about it. And so I want to tell you that I'm extremely grateful for you coming on to the Sobriety Matters podcast and taking an hour out of your day on a Sunday to join me and to tell your story. So with that, Amy, thank you very much for joining me on the show.
Thank you very much. I'm also very grateful that we connected and that we got to have this chat. And I think that this has been like my favorite podcast episode.
Well,
so
I appreciate that. And I definitely look forward to growing in our relationship in the sobriety community and supporting anywhere we can. So
yeah,
thank you.
awesome. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you.
If I may, can
Yeah.
I just like offer something, a little gift for your listeners?
You sure can. Absolutely.
Okay. So for anyone who's listening, I offer it's called the 5-Step Guide to Kickstart Your Sobriety. It's a free workbook that's available on my Instagram channel or my website. So like, I know for a lot of folks, when we're getting started, it's like, great, I've quit drinking. And then what? What do I do next? So this workbook is designed to sort of help you in those first steps and in those first, early days of sobriety. So that's totally free and on my website and Instagram if you'd like it. And for anybody who's interested in potentially doing coaching, I would love to offer a 10% discount off one-on-one coaching packages to any listeners with the Sobriety Matters 10 as a discount code.
Oh, that is very generous of you. And I definitely appreciate that. And I'll be sure that all of that gets linked in the show notes. So for anyone that may not see the show notes and is just listening, for Instagram and Facebook, you can find Amy at Miss Amy C. Willis. That's MS Amy C. Willis. And then her website is Hall and Well, HOL and well.com. And as I said, I'll put that all in the show notes. So again, Amy, thank you. That was unexpected and very generous. And we appreciate that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.